you so much for coming tonight for First Wednesdays. It's nice to see a big crowd. I'm ever so grateful it wasn't last night. I think it might have, we still could have pulled in a big crowd, but it's better tonight. My name is Lucinda Walker, and I am the director of the Norwich Public Library. Just before we start, I want to ask, how many of you have never been to a First Wednesdays event? Show of hands? Oh, wonderful, thank you. Thank you for coming out tonight. You will see that we have some clipboards going through the audience, and we would ask that to help the Humanities Council better understand who's coming to these events. If you could just fill it out, give us your name, or if you're already on the mailing list, tell us what town you're from. It's really important for us to understand the outreach that First Wednesdays has in the community. So those will just go around, sprinkle them around. We would really appreciate it if you could fill that out. First Wednesdays is a program of the Vermont Humanities Council, and it is co-hosted by the Norwich Historical Society and the library. And the Vermont Humanities Council receives support for the overall program from the Vermont Department of Libraries and the National Life Group Foundation. The Norwich Historical Society and the library receive funding for First Wednesdays from the Friends of the Norwich Public Library, the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation, the Ledger National Bank, Mascoma Savings Bank, and the Historical Society. Tonight's special underwriter is the Norwich Bookstore, and Penny McConnell will be selling copies of the quartet after the talk. I would please remind you to turn off all your mobile devices, and I just got a new one, so I better run over and do the same myself. And to introduce Mr. Ellis is Peter Gilbert, the Executive Director of the Vermont Humanities Council. Thank you.
Well, thanks for coming out this evening. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been looking forward to this evening for a very long time. The opportunity to introduce and to hear from Professor Joseph Ellis. Joseph Ellis is one of the nation's leading scholars of American history. He's the author of 9 books. He was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Founding Brothers, the Revolutionary Generation. He won the National Book Award for American Sphinx, a biography of Thomas Jefferson, and his in-depth chronicle of the life of our first president, His Excellency George Washington, was a New York Times bestseller. His newest book, The Quartet Orchestrating the Second American Revolution, 1783-1789, was released earlier this year. His essays and book reviews have appeared in myriad national publications, including the New York Times, the LA Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Chicago Tribune, the New Republic, and the New Yorker. You may have seen his commentaries on PBS, CNN, on C-SPAN, and he's featured in several public broadcasting historical documentaries, including the PBS American Experience program on John and Abigail Adams, of course, and a History Channel documentary on George Washington. Professor Ellis just told me that this is the first autumn he hasn't been teaching in over 40 years. And we're delighted to have him here today. He is a professor emeritus from Mount Holyoke College, where he taught for 40 years. He's taught at a number of other places as well, including the Honored College at UMass, at the United States Military Academy at West Point, and he most recently taught in the Leadership Studies program at Williams College. The fact that he is a Pulitzer Prize winner brings attention to the fact that 2016 is the 100th anniversary of the creation of the Pulitzer Prizes. I'm pleased to tell you that in 2016, between January and May, for those first 5 months of this First Wednesdays season, there will be a Pulitzer Prize winner or a talk about Pulitzer-related issues in each one of the 9 First Wednesdays communities, sites around the state, at least one. And in the fall, October, November, and December, we'll also feature other Pulitzer Prize winners. So that's a look into the future. I hope you'll stay tuned for that. Hope to see you Next month, Peter Saccio from Dartmouth has agreed to talk about Cymbeline to come out of retirement, and looking forward to that as well. But tonight, a treat, very much so. Won't you join me, please, in welcoming Professor Joseph Ellis.
Thank you for that gracious introduction, David. Lucinda, thank you as well. And thank you for coming in on a not-so-perfect evening, although it could have been worse if it were yesterday. I brought my own entourage with me just in case nobody else showed up. And somewhere back there is my wife, Ellen, my middle son, Scott, and his wife, yes, Jenny. Stand up so that people can see it. Stand up! Actually, my middle son, Scott, had something to do with the creation of this book called, what's the name of this book? The Quartet. Scotty was teaching at a school in Putney, Vermont, Greenwood School, which is a school for middle school boys with serious dyslexic problems. And is that right, Scotty? And he was teaching science, but every year the graduating class in their senior year, whatever they call it, is required to get up and give a speech before the assembled throngs, usually includes their parents that fly in from all over God's green earth to see them. Anyway, Scotty asked me to be the judge of the oratorical contest, along with a few other people. And now most of the 30-odd boys picked the speech that I think you would regard as the most famous speech in American history. What's the most famous speech in American history? If you wanted to pick a second choice, what would you pick? Farewell Address. Good guess, but it was never a speech. It was never delivered. Second inaugural is a great choice, but only a few really sophisticated people will understand why Lincoln's second inaugural is perhaps greater.
I have a dream.
Pardon me? I have a dream. That's the other one they picked. And if you're of a certain age, Kennedy's inaugural. Those are the three that get picked. All right. Because I had to listen to 25 kids deliver this thing, at some point in the 15th or 16th version, I realized that the first sentence in the most famous speech in American history is historically incorrect. Just wrong. See if we can do together the first sentence. All right? I'll start us off, and you join me. 70 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation. Stop. Then it says, conceived of liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, right? Yeah. Conceived a new nation. No, they didn't. 1776, they announced that they were splitting from Great Britain, but as a confederation, not a nation. A confederation of sovereign states represented in something called the Articles of Confederation. Indeed, the Resolution for Independence said it clearly. It said, written by Richard Henry Lee, voted on 2 July 1776, that these united colonies are and have every right to be independent states. Okay. And if you think about it, the whole set of arguments that the colonies had been hurling at Great Britain between 1765 and 1775 suggested that political sovereignty did not lie in Parliament, but in the colonial legislatures, which now become state legislatures. And if you think a little bit about it more, an average citizen born in that and raised at that time, was born, lived out his or her life, and died within a 27-mile radius. They didn't think nationally, they thought locally. In fact, the state was the biggest possible region that they could think of as a political community. Now, there's reasons why Lincoln has to lie in 1863. And he convinced himself he was telling the truth, so he wasn't lying. Because otherwise, the Confederacy had a legitimate argument. Not about slavery, but the argument that they had a right to secede. Because if Lincoln had said not 1776, but 1787, oh, then we're in different territory. But you get what I'm saying. And the important thing here is to say that in 1776, we're not a nation. We don't want to be a nation. We come together to win the war and then go our separate ways, which is what they did. And then this causes a real problem. Well, how did we get from 1776 to 1787? See, if Lincoln's right, it's easy. We come together to win the war, we wait a while, and then we come together again to become a nation. Makes a lot of sense, except that's not the way history worked. I would say that the deadest zone in American history is the 1780s. It's like this interregnum. Nobody knows what happened. But we know before something great happened, the revolution, the war, and something really great happened at the end, the Constitution and the nation, but we don't know what the connection between the two of them is. Now we have a magisterial new book to explain how this really happened. And the argument that I want to make, and it goes on, that is to say, in the 1780s, things get worse. All the energies are centrifugal rather than centripetal. Okay? We have a debt of $40 million at the beginning. By the end of this period, it's $77 million. You know, someone said the only two modern miracles are Einstein's theory of relativity and what's that thing that happens when you have money and it keeps earning? Compound interest. That's it. Each state has its own foreign policy. Massachusetts has negotiations about tariffs. New York is charging tariffs to all the other New England states. They like this arrangement, by the way. They're going to vote against ratification for this very reason. And we've got this whole empire that we won, and nobody knows how we're going to manage it. Because how can a confederation manage an empire? Georgia's got its own Indian policy, different from Pennsylvania's. By the way, Georgia claims that its western border is the Mississippi. Virginia originally claims, you know what its western border is? The Pacific. They call it the South Seas. All the original maps, by the way, are like the old New Yorker map. You know, like there's the East Coast, the West Coast, and like it's 200 miles in between. One of the heroes that I'm trying to recover is a guy called John Jay. The quartet, for your information, is George Washington, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. The argument that I try to make is that American history is headed in a particular direction in the 1780s. It's not heading towards nationhood. It's headed towards an American version of the EU. It's a regional set of sovereignties. That's where we're going. And four guys say, I don't want us to go there. I'm going to change the direction in which American history is headed. And they do it. And if this story is true, and of course I have to believe it is, this is the most dramatic and consequential act of political leadership in American history. I get irritated on occasion in reviews. Most of the reviews have been very nice, and I don't mean bad reviews, but people say, this book by Ellis, it's nicely written, it's an excellent synthesis of what we already know. No, it's not. Nobody has ever said this. Now, they should have. It's an interpretation that's hiding in plain sight. Nevertheless, partly because the profession, and I'm a card-carrying historian, is moved off in another direction. Young historians today don't study dead white males. They study blacks, women, and Native Americans, if they do early America. If you don't study them, you're out of it. And it's not fashionable to have a historical interpretation that gives credit to an elite. Things that really are good always happen from the bottom up, so they believe. Well, guess what? That's not true in this particular case. This is an elite-driven moment. Most people, well, if you took a poll, and of course, polls in the modern sense were unavailable, I would say it would go like this with regard to movement towards a constitution. 20% were in favor, 40% were opposed, and the rest couldn't care less. They really couldn't care. They were living in their own worlds, and the limits of their farms constituted the limits of their own thinking. Vermont is in this story. Vermont wants to become a state in 1782, 83, as soon as the war's over, right? It's held up until 1790. Why? Exactly what I'm talking about. You think we have a dysfunctional Congress now? This was an inherently dysfunctional government. It wasn't supposed to be a government. It was supposed to be like a League of Nations. Massachusetts claims part of the land that Vermont wants. New Hampshire claims more, and New York has claims on some too. And Virginia doesn't want Vermont in because it's another New England state and it will give greater weight to that section. They combine to block Vermont statehood for 6 years. And then when the Constitution is passed, Vermont's the first state in the Union, as we all know. Okay. How does this happen? The four men, three of them happened to be together in New York. Madison, Jay, and Hamilton are all serving in the government under the Confederation Congress. Jay is the head of foreign policy. They call it superintendent of foreign policy. It's really great. Adams and Abigail, too, writing from London and say, how can we have a foreign policy when we don't have a government? Massachusetts is over here signing its own treaties. They laugh at us as American ambassadors. Speaking of Jay, I started to tell you the story before. August 1782, Jay is in Paris, and he's standing in a room with a guy called Aranda. Aranda is the Spanish minister to France. What are they doing? They're trying to begin negotiations for what becomes the Treaty of Paris, ending the American War for Independence. Why is Jay talking to the Spanish ambassador? Because the American instructions from the Congress are, do nothing without the French. But the French have a treaty to do nothing without the Spanish. So I got to talk to Aranda. They lay a map out on the table of North America, a reasonably accurate non-New Yorker kind of map. Aranda puts his finger on Lake Erie and draws a line straight south through Ohio into what is now Tallahassee. He says, everything east of that line is yours, everything west of that line is ours, Spain's. Jay doesn't have to draw a line. He puts his finger on the Mississippi. Everything west of that line is yours, everything east of that is ours. Non-negotiable. He doesn't have a cell phone to call in to find out if he has the approval of anybody, but once it's clear that Spain and France are going to resist American control of the eastern third of the North American continent, Jay says to Franklin and to Adams, we have to break our instructions. And they do. And that's how we get the eastern third of North America. And if you think about it, when the war starts, who ever says, we're fighting this war to win an empire? We're fighting it for independence. Well, independence is the great principle, but the empire is the great prize. And it sits in the minds of all the four people I've described as something that requires a nation to manage. Okay. How does it happen? How do we get a constitutional convention? It's suggested many times in the 1780s, and as soon as it's suggested, it's killed by the very thing it's trying to cure, the problem we have with our current Congress. Because the committees won't listen to it. They just let it die as a proposal. There is a meeting in Annapolis in 1786. It's supposed to talk about some sort of cooperation among the states for interstate commerce. Only 5 states show up. Not a quorum. It's a failure. But Alexander Hamilton and Madison are there, and they, mostly Hamilton, writes a piece saying, we who have met here agree that there's a need for a more comprehensive convention to look at all the problems that we have under this form of government called the Articles. It's like some club fighter has just been knocked out by a journeyman boxer and has decided to declare himself heavyweight champion of the world, because there's no chance that this second convention is going to work. Something happens in between, down around our neck of the woods, called Shays' Rebellion, that prompts a sense of urgency that didn't exist before. And here's where Madison, Hamilton, and Jay start to talk to each other. And they say, this provides an opportunity. What do we need to do to avoid the fate of Annapolis? Failure. There's only one thing we can do. Get Washington. If we get Washington, everything we do has a chance. It legitimizes it. And so they begin the courting of Washington. Washington is embedded beneath his vine and fig tree in Mount Vernon, and he does not wish to leave. Later on, when he's elected president, no president in American history did not wish to be president more than George Washington. On many occasions in recent weeks, I've thought what kind of instructions Washington would give to Donald Trump. It would be, the speech you should deliver upon nomination is to say, you did not seek this. In fact, you seek to avoid it at all costs, that you're not qualified to serve. And if anybody else could do it instead of you, they should. Washington also has declared himself to be retired for life. He has committed the Cincinnatus Act. Cincinnatus, the great Roman general, swords into plowshares, retires from active service into retirement. Everybody knows him for his surrender of power. He is an aficionado of exits. And one thing about Cincinnatus can't come back. And that's what he says, I can't do this. Nobody cares more about it than Washington, because Washington understands from firsthand experience what the problems are with this government. He has spent 7.5 years leading a Continental Army, seriously understaffed, underfed, underclothed. He said at the beginning of the war, if you give me what I need, I can win the war in 2 years. The total size of the American population is a little over 3 million. We have about 200,000 adult males of military age capable of service. You just give me half of that, 100,000. I'll win the war in less than 2 years. He never got more than 15,000. The states took care of the states' militia, not any larger purpose. The people in the Continental Army are the dregs of society, the people with no options. And in a given year, it would be 12 to 15,000. At the end of enlistments, it'd go down to 3,000, and it'd be like an accordion and swell again. But Washington was profoundly aware, because of his experience, of the inadequacies of the existing Confederation. He says it was a nugatory government, headed towards anarchy. He wants to do something, but he says, I can't do it. In addition, if you look in his papers, it's almost elegiac. He keeps talking in terms of, I'm gliding down the stream of life. He's in his mid-50s. No male on the Washington line for 5 generations had ever lived past their 50s. His hourglass is running out, he thinks. When he sends his last letter to Lafayette, after Lafayette just leaves Mount Vernon in 1784, and he says, you know, you'll never see me again. And you know, it's hard, but I have had my day. That's what he thinks. And he doesn't have any desire to come back. How do they get him? They get all 3 of them go, 3-on-1 on Washington. Jay, Madison, and Hamilton. And Hamilton especially powerful because he served with him throughout the war as his aide-de-camp. They get another guy called Henry Knox, who was his artillery officer, the old Henry Knox, the only guy, the fattest guy in the Continental Army, looks like Santa Claus. And they convince him that if this thing succeeds, it will guarantee his legacy as father of your country. That's what they say. It's the first time that phrase gets used, father of his country. And it's got a shot at succeeding if you do it. Washington's influence is significant because, here's what he says to Madison. Okay, I'll do it on one condition. We go for broke. No middle position. We're not going to reform the Articles, we're going to replace them. Even though we don't have the authority to do that. And if we don't do that, it's not going to make much difference. Therefore, the only way I'll do it is a radical approach. And Madison says, okay. Madison then takes over in the next chapter more than anybody else. And if you're a client, well, you would want Madison as your lawyer. If God is in the details, Madison is there to greet him upon arrival. And Madison is not looking, as Charles Beard and the economic interpreter people, looking at his portfolio and saying, what's going to happen to my investments if we do this? He's reading David Hume, Adam Smith, Montesquieu, and trying to figure out how to make an argument that switches sovereignty from the state to the federal level that will win. And that's what he spends the entire spring of 1787 doing. Madison is often called the father of the Constitution for good reason, but his greatest contribution is made before it ever meets. And he draws up on the basis of his study something called the Virginia Plan, which calls for the creation of a 3-part government: executive, legislative, bicameral legislature, independent judiciary, clear line of sovereignty, federal government sovereign. In fact, in his idea, the federal government has a veto over all state legislation. That's the plan that sets the agenda at Philadelphia in May of 1787, because nobody else is ready. In the convention, this is heretical to say this, or near heretical. What people actually say in speeches makes almost no difference. The result is baked in from the beginning. What do I mean? There are three groups. Radicals want to get rid of the Articles and replace them with the federal government that's sovereign. Moderates who want change in the Articles, varying kinds of change, some degree of authority over foreign policy, over tax policy. Ooh, that'll be tough. Conservatives want no change. The conservatives boycott the convention. Patrick Henry says, "I smell a rat." Then the others boycott it because they don't care. Like, the same thing's going to happen in Philadelphia that happened in Annapolis. We don't have to worry about this. Plus, I don't care. So the fight's going to be between radicals and moderates. The radicals for clear sovereignty of federal government, the moderates for something that's a revision of the existing articles. On the first day, they say that voting will be conducted in the same manner as it has been under the Confederation Congress. One state, one vote. That means Delaware, with 60,000 residents, has the same representation as Virginia, with 378,000. That means the small states can block anything. That means it's going to be a compromise between the two positions. And the Great Compromise, also called the Connecticut Compromise, is reached in July when they agree that for purposes of representation, the House will be by population and the Senate will be by state. This is a victory for the statespeople, okay? This then translates into that strange contraption called the Electoral College, and it means that the vote on the president will be also distributing the state power versus national population power. Most people in Europe still haven't got the vaguest idea what this thing is called the Electoral College, and for good reason. Anyway, there are two ghosts at the banquet of the convention. One they can't stop talking about, that's monarchy. Any discussion of executive power that suggests that we might have robust executive power is regarded as monarchical. They can't figure out what to do. They talk about executive power more than anything else. They eventually figure out how to elect the president and how to impeach him. They spend a lot of time in August doing that. But you read the Constitution and what it says about the executive branch. You tell me what it can do. Nobody knows. Leave it ambiguous and let Washington figure it out when he gets there. And they are pretty sure it's going to be Washington. Slavery, just the opposite. So ominous, you can't talk about it at all. The word will never appear in the document, either slave or slavery. Well, how do you talk about it? That species of property. For those people who wanted to see, especially from South Carolina and the Deep South, a clear statement supporting slavery, they lose. For those people from other states in the North that wish to see something on the other side, putting slavery on the road to ultimate extinction, they lose. Most people think it's going to die a natural death because slave labor can't compete with free labor. They don't foresee the cotton gin, which doesn't come until 6 years later, 1793. The net result is a compromise on slavery, an extension of the slave trade for another 20 years. About 500,000 people come in during that time, by the way. Curiously, this fools a lot of people. Virginia votes against any extension of the slave trade. All Virginians want to end the slave trade. You think that means they want to end slavery? No. No. They're well stocked. If you end the slave trade, their slaves become more valuable and they'll sell them to South Carolina and Georgia, which is what's going to happen. So they look like they're taking a moral position. It's not really a moral position at all. Jefferson loves this position, you know. This is perfect for Jefferson. He looks like he's the great, and he's not even there, by the way. But anyway, the net result is a document that makes no one happy. The doctrine of original intent, a judicial doctrine shared by at least 4 members of the current Supreme Court, is dependent on the notion that there were clear original intents. They aren't. In fact, nobody got what they wanted. We'll talk about that in a second, an extension of that. Let me see where we are. Okay, we gotta move. In the end, Madison comes to understand. Madison speaks more than any other person at the convention, save one. Gouverneur Morris. You ever heard of Gouverneur Morris? He's a tall guy, peg-leg guy. Got the same exact torso as Washington, 6'2½". In fact, the statue of Washington in front of the Virginia Capitol is Washington's head, done by Houdon, the great French sculptor. It's Gouverneur Morris's body. Because Morris is in Paris and they take the peg leg off. This guy is really an important guy too. He doesn't make my quartet, but he's really an interesting guy. In August, at the convention, they create a committee of style. The committee of style is supposed to put together all the drafts into a single final draft. Always, you want to get on the committee of style if you possibly can. Hamilton and Madison are on this committee, and they delegate it all to Gouverneur Morris. So, Jeopardy question: Who wrote the Constitution? Gouverneur Morris did. Nobody will know that. The draft he has reads like this: We, the people of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, down the coast. He changes it by himself. Nobody tells him to do this. Nobody questions it. He changes it to we, the people of the United States. That is an enormous change. It is what they've been arguing about all summer. And he just changes it rhetorically himself. It's a statement about the existence of a people called the American people before they really exist. The Constitution is a roof without walls. That is to say, there is no national, it's the creation of a national framework for a people before the people exist. No national ethos exists in the United States until at least after the War of 1812, and I would say it doesn't completely come into existence until after the Civil War. But they create the framework. And the framework, if Madison, and he comes to understand this, if Madison had gotten what he wanted, it would have never been ratified. So, let's look at the ratification process for a second. I'll move quickly here. There's a great book on this by Pauline Maier, and if you want to know what happened in all 12 states, Rhode Island boycotts. Rhode Island boycotts everything. Have you ever noticed how initially, until 10 or 20 years ago, like if you want to get from eastern Massachusetts to Rhode Island, it's hard as the dickens to get there, okay? They had roads designed not to get you there. And then you think, well, that makes sense, because remember, from Massachusetts' point of view, Rhode Island is where you send the witches, the Quakers, and the lunatics, okay? Send them all down there. Well, in the Revolution, Rhode Island is the eccentric state. It vetoes everything. And it refuses to cooperate it doesn't send anybody to Philadelphia for the convention and boycotts the ratification process. With regard to the ratification process, I've noticed that I mentioned one thing is already illegal about the Constitution. They didn't have a mandate to get rid of it, they had a mandate to amend it. They violated that. According to the Articles, in order to amend the Articles, you need an unanimous vote by the states. Well, that's dead in the water with Rhode Island out there. So they say, the people in Philadelphia, supported by the Congress back in New York, 9 states will suffice for ratification. Illegal. Totally illegal. But the name of the game in ratification is get to 9. Once we get to 9, arguments make no difference. Everybody's got to come in. So let's stack it so the easy states come first, like Delaware, we all know how they're going to vote. And the tough states, like Virginia, New York, come late. And that's what they do. Also, they write something called the Federalist Papers, written by Hamilton, who writes 51, Madison, who writes 29, and Jay, who writes 5. Jay gets hurt, he has an injury and a sickness, and knocks him out. If you read all of the papers from the various states, God help us, I have done that. The pattern you see is that there is no pattern, which is like in the Sherlock Holmes, the dog that did not bark. It's the most important piece of evidence we have. We cannot have a national conversation. People cannot think beyond their local, regional, state borders. They can't do it. The only publication that thinks nationally is the Federalist Papers. There's no such thing as the Anti-Federalist Papers. Anyway, if you want to know what happened in every state, in every county, in every region, read Pauline Maier's book on ratification. My view is there are these patterns. The larger one is that there is no pattern that you should understand, and that the sequence makes a big difference. Get to 5, get to 9 is Madison's strategy. And final piece of very important decision making by my quartet guys. 1,638 people are going to meet in 12 different states. This looks like a pretty good, robust democratic thing, right? But you got to vote aye or nay. There's no middle position. Most people say, I like some things in this thing called the Constitution, but I want to modify it, amend it. You don't have that option. Well, who decided that? Madison. He just told them, the state, he said, if you vote with amendments, it will be regarded as a nay, and you're out. And so I said, I'm surprised nobody called him. You know, like especially in New York, Governor Clinton is really powerful. New York was 5-1 stacked against ratification. Okay, there was no way it could pass in New York, and they just were holding what Hamilton and Jay were doing in New York ratifying convention is delay until Virginia votes and becomes the 9th state. And then they're fooled. New Hampshire votes first, votes earlier. Nobody thinks it's going to change its mind and votes and becomes the 9th state. And then Virginia becomes the 10th state and New York is left. What Hamilton does, the most important thing he does is have what we would call Pony Express riders in Richmond, Virginia, carrying them to Poughkeepsie, New York, to let them know right away. Anyway, the ratification process ends successfully in 1789, and 6 of the states, while not having conditional amendments, we accept on the condition, you can't do that, they make recommended amendments. We ratify, okay, that's good, right there, but here are things we recommend you do once the government comes into action or into reality, becomes reality. That's how we get the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights is a solo act by Madison. Nobody else does anything until he finishes this and then sends it to the Senate and then the House. He works on this in the spring of 1788. Why? It is not so we can have our own version of Magna Carta. He doesn't think we need a Bill of Rights. The states already have Bills of Rights. We decided not to do a Bill of Rights in Philadelphia because once you state what the rights are, well, who knows which ones you left out. But I'm persuaded, he says, that we should do this. Why? For a lot of philosophical reasons? No, totally political reasons. There are all these people that voted reluctantly to support this. We want to demonstrate to them that we're listening to their recommendations, at least to some. There are also people, he's really afraid, is in favor of a second convention, hoping to promote a second convention that will undo the first. This will undermine them. Madison sits down in the spring of 1788, and he has in front of him 128 pieces of paper. These are the 128 amendments recommended by 6 of the states that ratified. He is going to make the Bill of Rights out of these amendments, okay? The most frequent amendment recommended is some effort by the part of the states to claim that it don't have to pay taxes. Like, let's go back to the way it was under the Articles where you tell us we have to pay and we say, screw you. That's the one. All 6 states that have amendments, recommend amendments, they recommend this. Put that in the dead letter file. That's never going to make it. 4 of the states have recommendations opposing the creation of a standing army. Madison says we should listen to this, okay? And that's how we get the Second Amendment, okay? Now, there are people out here not going to like what I'm going to tell them here, but this is biblical truth coming at you. The Second Amendment reads, a well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The decision, majority opinion by Mr. Justice Scalia in 2008 in D.C. versus Heller argued that the original intent of the framers in that document is to recognize the right to bear arms as a natural right. It is absolutely clear that is not what Madison intended. It is absolutely clear the intention of the framers is to make the right to bear arms a derivative right deriving from service in the militia. There's no question about it. If you're in favor of the right to bear arms, and I know even Bernie Sanders has to vote for this in Vermont, you can find perhaps another rationale for your convictions, but it is not present in the Second Amendment of the Constitution of the United States, as originally intended. It is in Scalia's opinion, or the clerks that work for him, but I would tell you that's a 32-page decision, which is absolutely preposterous. And that, I'm going to conclude on a note here, and I'll quote from Jefferson, who wasn't even present in Philadelphia, but was the most lyrical of them all with words, as we know, on the doctrine of original intent. That is the belief that we can look back to the framers. I've spent a lot of time trying to understand these guys, but the notion that we should look back to them and regard them as, oh, you know, tongues of fire appeared over their heads during this moment, and therefore we should take literally what they say as the grounds for our own interpretations up here in the present. This is what Jefferson said. People always asked him about this. What do you think? This comes from a letter to a friend called Samuel Kercheval in 1816. Some men look at constitutions with sanctimonious reverence and deem them like the Ark of the Covenant, too sacred to be touched. They ascribe to the preceding age a wisdom more than human, and suppose what they did to be beyond amendment. I know that age well. I belonged to it and labored with it. It deserved well of its country. But I also know that laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind. As that becomes more developed, more enlightened, as new discoveries are made, new truths discovered, institutions must advance also and keep pace with the times. We might as well require man to wear still the coat which fitted him as a boy, as civilized society to remain ever under the regime of their barbarous ancestors. This is how the book ends. Jefferson spoke for all of the most prominent members of the revolutionary generation in urging posterity not to regard their political prescriptions as sacred script. It is richly ironic, but one of the few original intentions they all shared was opposition to any judicial doctrine of original intent. To be sure, they all wished to be remembered, but none wished to be embalmed. Thank you very much. We don't need microphones here. This is a church. You know, I've appeared at the Vermont Humanities Wednesday things 3 times. Once in Manchester and once in Brattleboro, and now here. And every place it's been a church, which is great. I mean, this is a wonderful place. But if there are any questions or comments, let's hear it. The best kind of conversation is an argument. So if you disagree, don't hesitate. Yes, sir.
I'd like to just pursue this business about joining the militia and retaining a gun.
Who wants to talk about the Second Amendment? Yes, sir.
I've understood that, well, if you, it's a question really. If
Yeah.
you joined the militia, you had to have it, bring your gun to it, or could you join the militia and the militia would give you the gun?
They prefer you have it. And the argument is that the militia will be well served if everyone possesses their own rifle, their own weapon. Okay? And what's underlined is a worry on the part of the states that there will be a professional army created that will impose on them, will violate their liberties in the same way the occupation of the British Army did during the 1770s. That's what they got in their minds. And in the original draft of the Second Amendment, Madison has a line that says, those people who, for religious reasons, are not willing to serve, this is a law that doesn't apply to them. So it makes it even clearer what's in his head with regard to the right to bear arms. If you are a member of the National Rifle Association or a bearer of guns, a hunter, and you want to believe you have a right to bear arms, you have a free right to believe that. And you might be able to come up with all kinds of reasons, but I'm telling you, it's not in the Second Amendment. Okay? You got to find it someplace else in your own imagination. Yes, sir.
Professor Ellis, I'm baffled by how 3 or 4 states that did not ratify could consent to being required to join.
You mean if suppose 9 went and 4 didn't? How would that work?
Yeah.
It depended on which states they were. If Virginia didn't, we were in deep doo-doo. Virginia is the biggest state. Remember, Virginia at that time includes West Virginia and what is now Kentucky. It's got the largest population and the largest economy. The vote in Virginia is close. It's 89 to 78. The winning votes come because of Kentucky. The people in Western Virginia think they'll be better off with Kentucky as a state, and that's more likely under the new federal government. Interestingly, in Virginia, the core of opposition comes from Tidewater, Virginia, because all the Tidewater plantation owners are heavily in debt to British and Scottish creditors. According to the Treaty of Paris, they are obliged to pay their debt. They owe about £4 million, a modern equivalent of $100 billion. And they say, we're going to finesse it. If the federal government's created, they got to pay. That's the reason they opposed the Constitution. Beard always thought the only people voting for and against had to do with your possessions if you were in favor. No, you oppose it because it's going to hurt you too. There are people in New York who vote against it because they're making a lot of money confiscating Loyalist estates illegally in New York City. They don't want to stop. But the point you're making, nobody knows because it didn't happen. But what would have happened if you got 9 states and then what would have happened, I think, they would have created a government and there would have been enormous pressure put on the next 4 states by Washington. George Washington would visit them. By the way, that's what he did to Rhode Island. He visits Rhode Island, and in fact, he goes to a synagogue in Rhode Island and makes a speech. It's a famous speech among Jewish Americans, as the recognition of Jews as equal members of American society under the separation of church and state. By the way, I think Jefferson actually wrote it, but Washington delivered it. But what I find even more amazing is how the states that were opposed accepted the notion that they couldn't make conditional amendments. If you really believe you've got a right to do that, just do it. Everybody was afraid to be left out. One thing I did take, the press is strongly in favor of ratification, 92% of the press. It's not representative of public opinion, but there it is. I don't know. How about that? I don't know. Yes, sir. We'll have one more after this, and then we got to get out because people got to go to work, and it's cold out there. Yes, sir.
The convention was convened to modify the Articles of Confederation.
Correct.
At what point did the delegates to the convention realize that they were creating a whole new constitution?
Madison and the Gang of Four know from the beginning that's their agenda. The Virginia plan gets written by Madison. Here, you get really specific. Heavy thunderstorms up and down the East Coast, especially in New England in May of 1787. None of the New England states are there the day it's supposed to start, the convention. The convention is delayed by 10 days. During that 10 days, Madison lobbies everybody else in the Virginia delegation and a few other people like Gouverneur Morris and another guy called James Wilson in Pennsylvania for the radical agenda. They're set, therefore, once the convention starts, Gouverneur Morris gets up and proposes the Virginia plan as the agenda, and nobody else has got anything to offer. And that changes the agenda and makes it for replacement, not just reform. And then that means the small states for moderate reform are fighting a kind of what is the word I'm looking for there? A defensive position throughout the rest of the convention. But the person who has the best preparation and is ready to go, and that's because of Madison, ends up defining the agenda in Philadelphia. By the way, it's interesting, even though in some sense the Constitution represents a fundamental change in the values articulated in the Declaration. The Declaration is about rights. The Constitution is about responsibilities. They want to make a big point of the continuity. And so that's why they have the meeting in the same building and in the same room that the Declaration is signed in. There's a big change happening here. It is a second American Revolution. I'll close on this if you'll. What makes the American Revolution a revolution? The term revolution by political scientists has been dominated by European thinkers of a Marxist hue, and the model is really the French or the Russian Revolution. And it means a change in one class replaces another class. It's a fundamental change in the structure of society. If that's your definition of revolution, the American Revolution is not a revolution. In fact, in some ways, the reason the American Revolution succeeds is because it's not a revolution that way. It's an evolution. Evolutions are much more successful, by and large, than revolutions. What makes the American Revolution a revolution is also not winning a successful war for colonial independence. Is that a revolution? Well, beating the greatest army and navy in the world is a pretty big achievement, but in the 19th and 20th century, we have lots of wars for successful colonial independence, and we don't call them revolutions. What makes it a revolution is what they do in Philadelphia in 1787. It creates the largest republic in world history that becomes the model for the liberal state in the 19th and 20th century, that goes on to defeat the monarchies of Europe in the 19th century, the totalitarian dictatorships of the fascists and Nazis, and then the communists in the 20th century, and represents the poster child for the way a government should be organized. There's only one dramatic, other option, and that's the Muslim Caliphate. And that means going back to 6th century medieval. And I don't mean, China is going to be exactly like us, or Russia is going to be exactly like us, but the existence of a bottomed on the principle of popular sovereignty and some form of market economy. That's what they created. That's what makes it a revolution. And so, if you ask Washington, it's one continuous thing. The title of the book is The Second Revolution. We're saying the first is 76. This is the second. This is the one that really culminates and institutionalizes the principles, though. Read this. It's not. I do believe it's written to be read and not to be just, footnoted in some graduate students' notebooks. And I want to thank you for coming out this evening.